So I want to open it up and give you all a couple minutes to share with the audience a little bit about you, who you are, what brings you to the table tonight as our expert of the panelists.
My name is Sandra Moore. Most people call me Sandy. I'm president of Urban Strategies.
Hi, I'm Eileen Berman. I am a local artist.
Good evening. My name is Antonio French. I am the alderman of the 21st Ward. It's in North St. Louis.
I'm Bob Duffy. I'm the associate editor of the St. Louis Beacon, but I'm actually here tonight more as a journalist and as a longtime resident of this neighborhood. And I was writing this in the last couple of days and really thinking very hard about it. I was dealing with Franz, the parachute journalist who came in and looked around and then went off and prepared this 4-minute show. I didn't know him, and I didn't realize that he was this thoughtful, intelligent young man who was really trying to bring home to us things about ourselves that we might not see close up. That said, I do want to comment that we have with us tonight Arthur Perry, who's a friend of long standing, who has been a stalwart member of the community, African American. His feeling is that he was misrepresented in the show because he really wasn't allowed to, or it wasn't shown talking about things that really mattered. Similarly, Karen Duffy, who was the white woman in the show, who's shown sitting outside talking about pretty houses and gates, there's no clue for the person looking at this show in London that Karen has been in business for 40 years and has provided not only a fine restaurant, but also a third place for the neighborhood where people have come together. And she's done it with great sensitivity and great caring for the neighborhood that we live in. So I'm just going to read the last couple of paragraphs and skip all the snarky stuff because that's not really my style. But I do want you to understand a point of view that has developed over a long period of time.
So Bob, I want you to know you're stealing my first question.
Sorry. And here I go. In the early 1970s, when I bought my $1 million mansion in Westminster Place, just south of Del Mar, for a grand total of $15,000, the situation in the central west end of the city was quite different than now. White people were in a stampede to St. Louis County, leaving behind some of the greatest housing stock in America, but more to the point, leaving vast areas of the city to poor and disenfranchised and economically and socially disenfranchised people. Houses all over the neighborhood stood empty, vacant, and vandalized. Blight by no means was confined to neighborhoods north of Del Mar, many of which, thank you very much, are as attractive as any of the neighborhoods to the south of this divisive boulevard. We were young then, Arthur Perry, Karen Duffy, and I. Karen Duffy, by the way, is no relation to me. And idealistic, and many other men and women of goodwill and firm commitments to racial and economic equality were in our ranks. We believed then, and I believe now, our investments of energy and treasure in the city were worthwhile. And I believe also that there was value in working to bring reinvestment, renewal, and vitality and diversity to a city too long defined by its deficiencies and so infrequently defined by the richness of its human resources, its history, its architecture, its cultural treasures, such as this foundation, and its natural beauty. I believe that our work paid off. Thus, it troubles me for the BBC, which has not such a great reputation these days, I must say. It troubles me for the BBC to confine and to define St. Louis as either racist or indifferent to the abrasive conditions in which so many of our fellow men and women live. To do so is rather like defining London by a 4-minute video of riots on the Tottenham High Road, or to represent Oxford by 4 minutes of descriptions of ethnic tensions along the Cowley Road. Neither characterization is complete, neither is nuanced. Both have elements of accuracy, but neither reveals a regard for the pursuit of a more complex, layered, contextual, and rigorously tested truth. How could the BBC staff possibly accomplish such a task in 4 minutes, we might ask? The answer is evident to me. It couldn't, and it didn't. Thank you very much.
So I appreciate Bob jumping feet first into our discussion. And what I appreciate about what Bob had to share is that as we all come here together tonight, it isn't just about hearing from our panelists, but about hearing from you all. Alderman French?
Well, first I want to thank Bob, because the most boring thing you can have on a panel is when everybody agrees. So he and I are going to disagree on this. I think that, one of the results, or maybe the symptoms of the city of St. Louis being so segregated is that most people's experience about St. Louis is completely defined by the neighborhood you live in. So some people have a knee-jerk defensive response. I call it the defensive cheerleader. All right, these are people who love St. Louis and have done a lot in their lives to better the city, and they see a lot of the great things that go on in the daily experience. And so when the city gets called one of the most racist places or divisive places or one of the highest crime places, there's always this chorus of people who just reject that completely. And what I think that does is it denies the experience of a lot of people in the city, if not a majority of people in the city. So the experience is different for people depending on what neighborhood you live in. So I think one of the things that the BBC video does is it looks at data. And as was said yesterday on data don't lie, I think is how you put it. And so it is undeniable that there is a huge economic and racial segregation in the city of St. Louis. What is our saving grace is neighborhoods like Bob's, the Central Corridor. Those Central Corridor neighborhoods are the only neighborhoods in the city of St. Louis where you have about 50-50, 60-40 population, where you can actually see some racial and economic diversity. But when you go to the extremes of South St. Louis and the extremes of North St. Louis, that diversity is not there, and you can't deny it. When you look at some wards that are 98% white, average home price is $300,000, and you look at neighborhoods north that are 98% black, unemployment in high double digits. These are undeniable facts. And so we have to look beyond our comfortable boundaries sometimes and look at the city as a whole and appreciate our faults.
That appeared in the Beacon the other day, and Mayor Slay was quoted in the Beacon as saying that it would be a terrible mistake to ignore the lessons of the Delmar Divide, but it would also be a mistake to allow the legacy of the Delmar Divide to blind us to the positive change and the growing opportunities that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. Do you think more focus should be on positive changes, as Bob was talking about, or has the video forced more people to have what some see as uncomfortable conversations?
Tara, in the spirit of full disclosure, you sent us those questions in advance. So I have been thinking a lot about that because I like our mayor a lot. We're contemporaries. Graduated law school, different law schools, but roughly the same time, and I like him. So I thought long and hard about that. Here's my response. I think he's right and right, and I think he's wrong in one area. First of all, the Delmar Divide has not yet reached the legacy stage. Precision in language suggests that legacy means that it has gone by. It has not. It exists. The second thing, and so therefore I say about us not having a legacy of Delmar defining us is imprecise because we haven't gotten past it yet. But then I'd say he's right because if we stay stuck in what is all wrong, we won't ever have the energy unless you people are a lot different than me. I have to get energized. We won't ever have the energy to do the work it does to change. And there's been enormous change. Otherwise, my friend, I wouldn't be sitting here.
That's right.
I absolutely concur with that. That if and I think, you know, as I'm sitting here and I'm seeing all these folks who've come out tonight, this video, no matter what I think about the nuances of it, has incredible power to bring people together to talk about things in uncomfortable conversations. So I think Sandra's exactly right, and I think Francis Slay is onto something. So I don't want anyone to leave thinking that Bob Duffy is just this middle-class white guy who doesn't know what he's talking about, because I've thought about it a lot, and I'm not a Pollyanna. I grew up in the South, and from the time I learned to walk, I was experiencing various epiphanies about race that have stayed with me, and about discrimination and about economic disenfranchisement. Thank you. So I'm just. I think I'm in the same pew with Francis Slay for pleading with the fact that we must, in order to go forward and in order to reconcile our differences, we do need to develop and to maintain an appreciation of what we have that is good.
I mean, I think that's important, but I just want to make a plug for friends who love each other so much and care about each other so much that they're critical of each other, and they say when you fall short and when you could do better. And I think that that's what this video does. It's what these conversations do. I think people, we can love St. Louis and be able to see that St. Louis can be better, and that's what this conversation really ultimately is about.
So I think if the defensive cheerleader was an action figure, it would look like Francis Slay, like in a suit. I mean, I think the mayor believes that his role is to be cheerleader for the city, and there's a time and place for being a cheerleader and touting all the great things that happen in St. Louis. We all love our city. But there's also a time to put down the pom-poms, and we need a quarterback to lead and to improve our situation. And the danger of what that kind of speak does, like was said, is it takes away the sense of urgency that we need to really deal with the problem. Because it's one thing about looking at home values, it's one thing to look at even an unemployment rate, but of the 150 homicides that happened in the city of St. Louis, the vast majority happened north of Delmar. It's dangerous for people. We're losing kids every day because of the social economic situation that they have to deal with. So, we need to really deal with this problem. Stop ignoring that it doesn't exist. Not feel like to acknowledge it is to say that we are somehow lesser, or that the great things that we are as a city don't exist. But that's a separate conversation. This conversation is about fixing a problem, and we should focus on that problem.
And it's always easier to talk about the positive things, but if you're someone in a position that's not experiencing all of that positive momentum, then those are some of the consequences. Yesterday, Sandra, you mentioned that we need to give our elected officials permission to have these conversations, that these aren't conversations that we have. And so I'm wondering, what does that look like? What does permission look like for our elected officials? How do we make them have these conversations?
Well, permission looks like this. I worked for a governor, and I loved him, and he is deceased now. And I hope that you can't do anything from wherever people go after they die, because I'm going to say this. He was a good governor, but he counted votes. And for every single person, one face that he saw, he counted 10, 15, 20 votes. So this is the beginning of giving permission, because elected officials see votes. I said yesterday on the radio, and I maintain it, that any elected official, I didn't say this part, but I'm going to say it now, any elected official that would take on race in St. Louis on its own is crazy. It's a non-starter. People don't talk about race in St. Louis.
Why not?
Well, because we just don't. Blacks talk about it in black circles, maybe whites talk about it in white circles. I don't always operate in white circles, so I don't know. Did you hear what I just said?
Yeah.
I have a dual degree from Washington University, undergraduate and law degree. I don't always operate in white circles. How can that be? But that's the reality. So I can tell you what we talk about. I don't know necessarily what Bob at his dinner party talks about. But the point I'm making is people who vote have to say to elected officials, we want to solve the problem of the racial divide in this community. You have to give them permission. You've got to give them permission to do what it is you seek.
Alderman, do you see that as a conversation stopper? If an elected official attempted to put race on the table, to have a conversation about the way that this city is divided, is segregated, the disparity around race and economics, is that a conversation stopper?
I think in real political terms, I don't know if it's going to happen like that. I think what our leaders have to do, our elected officials have to do, is lead. They have to start the conversation sometime. Because I tell you, the city of St. Louis, our politics is as divisive as our neighborhoods.
Amen.
So, when you're running for citywide office, the trick is always, if you're white, you're going to get the white vote on South St. Louis. You got to win that. If you're black, you're going to start with the black vote in North St. Louis, and then it comes down to the Central Corridor. Who wins the Central Corridor? So, unfortunately, white politicians running the city of St. Louis haven't won with black votes in North St. Louis, and black politicians running citywide in the city of St. Louis haven't been too successful winning in South St. Louis, and so they stick with their base, and they just talk to their base, and it keeps us having these same conversations with our comfortable groups. And so what needs to happen to change that is to break away from your comfort zone and lead for the sake of the city.
When we started the Beacon, our mission was to do more than just have news on a page, and it was to get out of the community and try to not to force change, but to create atmospheres that were conducive to it. So we came up with a program called Race Frankly, and the whole purpose of it was to talk about race. And I led discussions in saloons. It was called the Barroom Conversations, and we had a pretty good time of it. But when it came to getting anybody to partner with us, the response was always either our group isn't ready for that or our audience isn't ready for that. So the only organization that stepped forward and said, we're with you, was the Missouri History Museum. And we had great programs there, attended by many, many people. I mean, it's impossible to measure any kind of moving of the needle, but I think that a lot of people who came to these programs and who went away sort of thinking, well, there's really something sort of systemically wrong in this city. We've got to do something about it. But I think that for a politician to have a frank conversation about race, it is, my audience isn't ready for that. And
So does that mean then that politicians are perpetuating some of these stereotypes, some of these thoughts about what their constituencies are ready for?
I want to jump in on that. And Alderman French said it was good to disagree. I disagree to some extent with both of these gentlemen. I do in fact believe that leaders have to choose to lead. And I get that. But it hasn't happened.
right.
That's right.
So at some point, the definition of insanity is what? Doing the same thing the same way and expecting to get a different result. That's one point. The other point I'd like to make is I don't want to get into the blame game for shifting the blame to some preordained group. It is all of our collective fault that we are in this position at this point in the evolution of this city. It is not accidental. It has been systemically designed and implemented and tolerated and promulgated by all of us. So to abdicate the responsibility for the fix to the elected officials so that we can then say, oh, well, they didn't get it done, I just am not buying that anymore. I'm here because I'm 58 years old. It's time to get it done.
I appreciate that, and you're absolutely right. It isn't about placing the blame on one group or one person. I do want to come back to Bob. Bob was talking about starting a beacon, and this is more of a media question, and I want you to consider the role that the media plays in perpetuating some of these stereotypes around race and around class. Specifically, I'm thinking about, for those of you who watch evening news in St. Louis, you know that every night we see violence and crime, and they're often focused in one part of the city. You know, I believe it was Monday night, they were talking about the increase in welfare recipients in the United States, and all of the images they showed were of people of color, specifically African Americans. And so what role then does the media play, and what is our responsibility as citizens to speak up and to prevent that from continuing?
Well, I think that we probably err on the side of not being entirely fair sometime, but our part of the mission, again, when we started out, was crime isn't something we do unless it is part of a bigger picture. We don't single out individual crimes and have the red lights flashing and so forth. So
let me interrupt you real quick. When you say that the media doesn't single out specific crimes, but
no, I'm not saying the media. I'm saying the Beacon. I think that I don't want to get in the blame business and being, sort of dissing the broadcast, the commercial media. But the saying is, if it bleeds, it reads, and that seems to be more and more sort of the attitude that if there's scandal involved, or if there's violent crime involved, it's going to be out there, and I think it's horrible, and we don't do that kind of stuff. We prefer to go in depth on problems regional problems that affect all of us one way or another. So you're not going to see rapes and murders in the Beacon. I think generally to say generally about commercial broadcast and print media in the United States, it's all pretty shabby and sensationalist, with some great exceptions. But it's not what we choose to do, and of course that's going sort of against the grain of what, with quotes around it, what people want to read. So we have to struggle with that. But just because people want to read that sort of thing doesn't mean that you have to give it to them. And I think that if you feel as if you have to give it to them, it only exacerbates the kinds of situations that we're talking about tonight. Because if you do take take African American faces and put them up against crime statistics, you're going to be in trouble. You're going to perpetuate a myth that is people have embraced as the truth, rather than a misconception.
Alderman, how do you feel about what Bob shared and how that impacts? Because most of the crime that we see presented each night is taking place. We know that it takes place throughout the city. It isn't just limited to North St. Louis. However, every night we turn on the news, that happens to be where crime is highlighted.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very real problem. And, it took me, I got angry about it for a while, and I wrote some letters and sent some emails trying to get people, the reporters, to take a little bit more time, use a neighborhood name, actually learn where the crime happened, and not just paint with such broad strokes, just North St. Louis, North St. Louis, because I think the effect is that it really scares people about North St. Louis. And what it also does is it makes people think that all of North St. Louis is the same, and it's all just a violent, desolate place where people don't live and zombies roam the street or something. It's just, they paint a really horrible picture. And so that was my response initially. When I first was elected, for that first year, I would just constantly call or write letters. And then what I started to do was actually make a conscious effort to change the story. So what I tried to do then is start, whenever we had a positive event, really work to get it on television, really work to let at least that night's broadcast have something positive about North St. Louis. And so if you see me on TV a lot, it's because I'm really trying to change the story about what's happening in our neighborhood, because it's not just a place where only violence occurs. We started a neighborhood newspaper called The North Side with one mission in mind, just to put out positive news about what's going on in North St. Louis. Because if you only get your news from local television news or the Post-Dispatch, it's 100% negative news most days about North St. Louis. And so we try to change the story and highlight some positive things that are going on. But the media does need to take more responsibility and frankly just stop being so lazy. Stop just, I've seen crimes even on Del Mar, in the same broadcast. If it was a positive story, it was on Del Mar in the Central West End. If it was a murder, it was on Del Mar in North St. Louis. It's the same street. But it's like the phrase North St. Louis has just become synonymous with bad things happening.
Eileen, you shared with us earlier that when you came to St. Louis, you were told that you should stay away from North Del Mar. However, that didn't prevent you from going into that part of the city and being an educator and an activist in that area. What caused you to go into North St. Louis and do the work you do?
I just saw it, and I had the ability to go in and start to create work around it. It's not easy, even for my own self. I mean, getting support on both the north and south side of Del Mar along Grand, it doesn't happen naturally. And so I just wanted to be a part of sort of showing that the wall is not necessarily impermeable. It doesn't have to stay. The one thing that artists get to do is dream and then try to make those dreams come true without a lot of extra worry about being voted into office or keeping a business going or even keeping a paper going. So I can, or a online paper, I know. So I think there's some real power in that, being able to just move yourself in those places and start to speak to people. So it wasn't, that part wasn't hard. I think getting it done was a little bit hard, but deciding to do it, I mean, that's easy.
I have one final question, and I was thinking about what Sandy said yesterday on St. Louis on the Air, and you talked about people being deliberate in their actions and doing critical thinking. And so when I think about people showing up this evening, this is a deliberate action that people are taking to at least engage in the conversation, but it has to go much further than these conversations. We have a lot of conversations in St. Louis about these issues, and people talk with one another about, oh, I went to hear this great program and heard people talk, but that's it. It doesn't go further than that. And so when you talk about being deliberate, what does that look like?
Well, I think it looks the same.
That was pretty good PR for the neighborhood. Probably helps them.
But before I open it up to the audience, I have one final question, and I was thinking about what Sandy said yesterday on St. Louis on the Air, and you talked about people being deliberate in their actions and doing critical thinking. And so when I think about people showing up this evening, this is a deliberate action that people are taking to at least engage in the conversation, but it has to go much further than these conversations. We have a lot of conversations in St. Louis about these issues, and people talk with one another about, oh, I went to hear this great program and heard people talk, but that's it. It doesn't go further than that. And so when you talk about being deliberate, what does that look like?
Well, I think it looks the same, but operates at different levels. I mean, being deliberate and being intentional means that you make a conscious decision to act, to eliminate this problem, if in fact you care about its elimination. And as individuals, then you line up a series of things that you can do. Let's just take this little snippet that we're having here about reporting. So why should anybody care about that if they don't live north of Del Mar? Probably don't even pay attention to it. I think it was Alderman French yesterday who said it usually goes out of your head if you don't live north of Del Mar. Here's why you should pay attention to it. Because cutting edge research from those brilliant guys at Harvard says that the brain development of poor kids is being seriously negatively impacted to the point of being considered post-traumatic stress syndrome by the notion of violence in their community. Now, why should you care about that? Because for every child who is non-productive, the impact on those of us who have resources is enormous. Let me say to you what I mean by that. The 63106 zip code, which is the far north side of the city, think 14th and Cast. Think 2 miles from the river headed north. That is the poorest zip code in the city, and it takes more state resources across every service delivery area than any zip code in the state. Now, who pays for that? Certainly not people whose average income is $10,000 a year. That's why you need to care. So at an individual level, if you care about it, then you have to pick out the 1 or 2 things that you're going to focus on and start to be deliberate about what can you do. Is it talking to your neighbor and so forth? But I want to get up the tier. But then those of us who have institutional engagement, either we work in institutions or we're members of organizations and institutions, we have to start to pose the question there. And those of us who run institutions, so it goes up the chain with some degree of deliberateness. And I'm going to end with this. I said it yesterday, but it just amazed me to watch America convince itself to stop smoking. When I graduated from law school in 1979 and walked into my first courtroom in 1980, everybody smoked. The judge smoked, the lawyer smoked, the client smoked. It was unbelievable. That's barely 35 years ago. And the direct opposite is true. Why? Because we were deliberate at every single juncture. Individuals were deliberate, churches were deliberate, health systems were deliberate, schools were deliberate. And so that is what I mean, up the chain of the systems that hold us together. We have got to have a focused and deliberate action around the elimination of this problem.
Anyone else want to add to that?
I would add too that it is, if there is one thing I hope to come out of this too, out of this discussion, and hope that it continues, is that we start seeing problems in either part of the city as the entire city's problem. And that's going to be key. So if you love the city of St. Louis and you care about the city of St. Louis, you know, we have to care about what happens equally to some of the poorest neighborhoods as our own neighborhood. You know, I got to say, you know, I'm actually very pleased every year when the city of St. Louis comes out as one of the most violent cities, because that's the one time a year that the violence in my neighborhood becomes all our problem. Besides that day, if 4 people got murdered in my neighborhood last night,